Hello? Okay, brilliant. Just gonna Tom, we can start the broadcast. Um, Thank you, Jeremy. Good morning, everybody. I can see that some of us who had a later night than others are not yet in the room, and hopefully they will join us presently. If yesterday was about everything that is going wrong at an accelerated pace and the complexity and the challenges of it all, as I expected, the day ended on, I suppose, a somber note, with all of us wondering what, if anything, could be done. Today, starting with this session, we will focus on Aotearoa, New Zealand, looking outwards, but also examples of how things can be done right, have gone right, and what lessons we can learn as a consequence of those examples, anecdotal as they may be, but perhaps systemic in the future. So you have your agenda with you, and for those of us joining on Zoom, a warm welcome, whatever time zone you're in. You have your agenda, so we have a shorter day than yesterday, but perhaps no less interesting one. I know that Jeremy thanked many before the Zoom broadcast started, but I wanted to very quickly take a minute, given that this may be the one session that we get a lot of interest in, and because of Paul, to acknowledge some of the individuals so that it's also on record to those of us on Zoom that made this conference happen. Please hold your applause or acknowledgement till the end. It's a very short list, actually. I wanted to thank the National Center for Peace and Conflict Studies, Richard in particular, but also Kylie, Al, all the staff, and all my colleagues, some of who are in this room, for helping this happen. From Otago, Ellie from Comms did an amazing job pushing this out. And then we have Jeff and Gemma from e-conferencing, the fruits of which we saw yesterday, which was absolutely amazing, the way that they managed Zoom. And of course, we have Tom, who you can't see, but is there, I assure you, and Tom and his team from Gravity, who are in the room and helping out with the AV. My friend and colleague, Jeremy, who most of you have been in touch with, who handled everything with regards to logistics, and worse, handled everything with regards to university administration. So there should be some sort of a prize for one, if not both. The volunteers, Sam, Keleka, Alejandra, and Ashley, if you've been following Twitter, all of those updates are from Ashley, and she's already won accolades from the world over for those. There might be a job in the offering, Ashley. Dave, our janitor, the person who we see every evening come to office and helps us do our work in his own quiet signature way with a conversation that is always very entertaining. All of the staff at the student union, Heather included, and the waiting staff and everybody who's helped make this room what it is and clean it up after we left. A particular thanks to my supervisors, Professor Clements and Ben Chantal, and in particular Twitter for their Data for Good initiative and project, through which NC PACS was able to do the research on Christchurch. So for all of you, thank you very much. With that, Paul, we are going to follow the same format as yesterday. I am not going to introduce you. You are free to introduce yourself, however you see fit. But thank you for joining us. I also wanted to recognize that as a consequence of what you've done for the past 2 years, and what you think the future holds with regard to your remit. So please take the floor.
Well, thanks so much, Sanjana. And for those who haven't met me, I'm Paul Ash. I work in the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet as the PM Special Representative on Cyber and Digital and as the Cyber Coordinator there. First, I'd like to say a big thank you to the National Centre for the opportunity to come and join you today. We've been really looking forward to this and the Christchurch Call team and to being part of the opportunity for a conversation. So hats off to you, Sanjana, and
Thank
to
you.
the team for pulling this together. I'd like to talk a bit about the Christchurch Call and what it is, and by doing that, partly what it isn't as well. In part because I think listening carefully yesterday, it was apparent to me that one of the things we do need to do better is actually tell the story of the Christchurch Call and build participation across the New Zealand community in the work. I guess a couple of things struck me out of yesterday as a preface to that. The first, I think it was Sarah O talking about the need to think systemically and strategically about some of these challenges. I think Susan Benesh made much the same observation, and the Christchurch Call is one of our efforts to do this in a particular problem set. The second was that by the end of the day, I think it would have been possible to leave yesterday feeling pretty gloomy and full of despair about the internet as a whole. And it's really important as we take our work forward to understand all the positive things that the internet has delivered and continues to deliver, and to work out how we preserve those. If we think about the moment in time we're in, I think, and go back to the mid-90s and the height of tech utopianism, the declaration of the independence of cyberspace, we're a long way on from that, and we've discovered the internet's probably a more Hobbesian world than we expected. I'm not sure why that surprises any of us. That should have been obvious. But we always like a utopian vision, and we'd all like to be able to preserve the best of that. That's something that I think, as we go through today, will be really important. The Christchurch Call itself is a direct response to the abuse of the internet by the Christchurch attacker 2 years ago this week. It's a multi-stakeholder effort, and that's critically important. It actually is about bringing governments, industry, and civil society together to work on problems collectively. It's grounded in the fact that all of the actions taken under the call must be consistent with international human rights law and with fundamental freedoms and with the principles of a free, open and secure internet. That sets a pretty high bar for those that would want to operate under the call. It's a set of voluntary commitments. Now, they are non-binding at law, but they are commitments and they have been made in public by those who participate in the call, and there's an expectation they will be upheld and that the call community as a whole will help to ensure that that happens. There is a growing community attached to the call. It's not just a document, but actually a large grouping now of countries, companies and civil society working together to try and solve a particular problem. It contains specific commitments for governments on their own, for companies on their own, and for the two of them working together, and a key role for civil society in participating in that. It's deliberately holistic. It takes a range of measures that are aimed at preventing the abuse of the internet, and it works across online and offline factors in trying to do that. That means that the commitments in the call cover a range of technical measures, so there's something for the computer scientists. Ali will be happy about that. But there's also a lot in there for the social scientists, the humanities people, public policy folk. There is research, there is soft and black letter regulation and regulatory tools. There is education, counter-speech, some specific technical tools. All of those are actually encapsulated within the commitments. And as we watch the problem growing, the problem set we're dealing with, we've actually been quite pleasantly surprised to find that the drafters of the call, and one of them is in the room, of anticipating what the terrorist and violent extremist content problem set would look like and the kinds of measures we might want to put in place to deal with it. And I guess the last piece is that the call is actually quite tightly constrained to that problem set. It's about terrorist and violent extremist content. And those 5 words are actually really important. It's not about the whole panoply of disinformation. It's not about electoral interference. It's not about child sexual exploitation or any of the other sorts of issues that we're grappling with. The intent was to take the proximate problem and the problem set and see how far and how deep we could go on trying to solve that. And if we could make progress there, perhaps we could find a blueprint for some of the other issues that bedevil us at present. I guess the last thing is it's deliberately collaborative. The effort is to try and bring the recognition that governments cannot solve this problem on their own, nor can companies, and nor can civil society. And as the PM has said many times, we can't just regulate our way out of this problem. We're actually going to have to think quite creatively about the tools we have to preserve the best of the internet. And we have 48 countries that have joined as supporters of the call. We have 3 intergovernmental organisations, one of which is the European Commission, which obviously has an enormous remit. We have 10 tech companies, from the largest in the world through to some smaller ones. We've also now, in recent times, added our first Asian tech company in the form of Line Corp out of Japan as a supporter of the call. And if you think about Line Corp, they've done some absolutely intriguing work in Chinese language markets and in Korean markets in recent times, and it's great to have them on board. We have a very active Christchurch Call advisory network of civil society members. We know it's very active because we engage with them all the time, and we really value the input they bring. And it can be quite confronting and challenging input. That's precisely why we have that network, to get that range of perspectives. And I think one thing I would advocate for those participating in this discussion is, if you'd like to think about participating in that network and contribute to the work of the call, please feel free to get in touch with christchurchcall.com. And the Christchurch Call inbox. I think we really value that diversity of input. What have we done to date? Well, there was a stock take last year of the call's work across the entire community. We sought input from everybody, and they found 4 key things that had been achieved to date, and I'm talking meta rather than specific actions. The first and thing that most participants valued most was the unique multi-stakeholder approach of the call. And its focus on preventing terrorist and violent abuse, extremist abuse of the internet. That was really heartening to hear that from almost all the participants, because it spoke to the value of bringing those different capabilities together to work on a shared problem set. The second was around the lift in awareness of the problem of terrorist and violent extremist abuse of the internet, and delivering some channels to engage on that. The third was around building crisis response protocols. What we saw in Christchurch was unprecedented, not because terrorist acts are unprecedented. In fact, we had a good conversation on that last night, but because the use of the internet in Christchurch and the response online was unprecedented. We've never seen an event live streamed before that has over 1.5 million uploads taken down on Facebook over the 24 hours afterwards, or that sees YouTube having a copy of the attack video uploaded every second for 24 hours afterwards. This was a deliberate effort by the Christchurch attacker that worked really well to subvert the controls, such as they were, that existed at that time. And what's more troubling is that there was a very, very sizable community, technically proficient and able to continue to pick up on his work, who worked really carefully to try and subvert all of the algorithmic processes and other things that tech companies had in place to hide the video off in the recesses of the internet and then pump it back, edited. Over 800 different copies of the video within the first 24 hours, edited, changed. All it takes is a pixel or two to be able to put that back in. We needed to respond to that, and we put in place crisis response protocols under the call. There weren't any at the time, or to the extent there were, they were manifestly inadequate for what we were now confronting. And there are now 3 of those in place, a piece of company work, a Christchurch Call crisis response protocol, which deals very much with communications and the politics of crisis response. How do you think about both reducing harm but also managing the social context around that? And then work that the European Commission and Europol have put together, which is very much around the material that investigators and prosecutors need. It's very much based in legal frameworks, and those 3 pieces are actually kind of critical to any crisis response. The last piece I think that the survey pulled up was the reform of the Global Internet Forum to counter terrorism, and that's been a major piece of work. The Christchurch Call really has been the key driver of that reform. It is the body that we would expect would pick up on many of the commitments in the call and provide the multi-stakeholder context for that. Previously, the Global Internet Forum had no staff. It had a brand. It had 3 programs, but it rotated around 4 tech companies. And while it presented well publicly and had some good work around hashing and some good work around research, it didn't really have critical mass or buy-in and really didn't provide a multi-stakeholder forum. It's now an independent organisation. It has a whole range of working groups working on specific problem sets. It has an independent advisory committee of governments and civil society working with industry, and is a real shift in capability. The full results of that stocktake will actually be released reasonably soon with some forthcoming events, and we will make sure that the data is open data that will be provided for researchers to work with. I guess it raises the question for us now, coming to the second anniversary of the launch of the call on 15 May, of where to from here. What do we do next? And perhaps that's something that would be really helpful to get feedback from anyone listening to this discussion, whether here or internationally, over the coming weeks. We've got a bunch of work prepared and underway for 15 May. For those of us working on the call, we end up living very strange hours here in New Zealand, being up through the night working on that, and have done for quite some time now. Effectively, I'll leave to the PM to announce what those next events look like, but we are currently working on what the third-year work program for the call would look like and how we intensify our efforts in some key areas. The first of those is working across all of the participants in the call to grow the sense of a self-sustaining community, one that can continue to work actively and that is facilitated to work on the issues, the commitments that sit in the call. The second is around dealing with some specific priority areas. The first of those is making sure that the resourcing and work of the GIFCT is consolidated, that it's a genuine multi-stakeholder workplace, and that we build confidence amongst the participants. Some of this work is going to require real trust across some sectors that have struggled to do that in the past, and it's going to require some real openness. And that's a hard thing to do. We can see examples of that elsewhere. If we think about the child sexual exploitation area, over the years we've actually seen multi-stakeholder work and trust circles that have done some extraordinary things in that area, and we would like to see some of that replicated. Same in cybersecurity. The ISACs, the CERT networks do this on a trust basis, and we want to be able to build that in this problem set. And it's going to take a bit of time. The second, and it's come up over the past day quite a bit, is deepening the work on algorithmic processes that have the potential to lead to radicalisation. Now, this is a particularly sensitive area. We've heard it in the last day. It's a topic of global debate at the moment. One of the strange things here is that our evidence sets are actually relatively limited for this work. And we need to build a stronger evidence base for the work we do. Our focus primarily in the call is on the outcomes of those algorithmic processes. It's not on grabbing the source code and playing with it. And I think I heard someone talk yesterday about just allowing an 18-year-old to change the algorithm. It's not that simple. Algorithmic processes learn on their own. They change, they shift. They can do that, as we see with things like software-defined networks in milliseconds. And we think it's probably more helpful for most of the people involved to look at the outcomes of those processes and set up some multi-stakeholder test beds so that we can then design effective interventions where there are problems. Either algorithms need changing, or we do things that we've learnt from public health. How many of you have ever Googled suicide? Okay, what happens? You get redirected. You get interstitials, and those interstitials are context specific. So wherever you are, they will direct you to local resources. There's work in terrorist and violent extremist content to do some similar things. There's a lot we can learn from public health, and a lot we can learn from actually treating the people that end up being radicalised as victims in this process as well. They are not always out there to perpetrate this stuff. There are some people who are, and we need different tools for them. But we need to be thinking across those disciplines about what interventions look like and how we practically want ahead with that algorithmic work. Three other key things that are important for us. First, we want to add a small number of countries to the call. We're probably getting to the point where the number of countries that can meet the human rights level protections and will actually treat the call in the spirit that it is intended is becoming reasonably limited. But we do want to bring some more on and make sure that we can actually build that capacity. The next is actually lifting the number of companies involved. We've got some really big tech companies in there. We would like to see that grow as we start to think about the network effects and the way that the internet stack works to promulgate terrorist and violent extremist content. Our first priority in the call was to get the content away from the largest number of eyeballs, work with the big platforms first. And over time, we're going to have to start to stretch that out a bit and think about CDNs and web hosting services and how we actually think about the services that host some of the worst of the content. This was the topic of a really tricky discussion with the internet companies when we first started building the call. But actually it was really interesting watching that discussion and ending up in a room. Liz and I were both there actually, whiteboarding this with some of Silicon Valley's most senior executives. Their question to us, do you really understand the internet stack? Our response, we think we understand a lot of it. Tell us more about what you know. Once we started mapping that out, actually it was helpful for them to see that we knew what we were talking about. That gave us credibility, but it was also helpful for some of those companies to say to their colleagues, no, we can't just exempt this whole area of the internet from this work. And by the way, in terms of web hosting, we've already conceded that because we kicked this organisation off our platform a year ago. And so if you think that's taboo territory, we've already gone there. Let's take an open mind to this. And what was really interesting about that, I'll just riff on this for a minute because it's important.
Well, if you could...
Yep. Is that big tech is not one amorphous blob. It's actually a whole range of different things we need to work with. And there's lots that we can do in those spaces. The last thing is around growing civil society capability. That's going to be critical for taking this work forward. There are some other areas, and we're really open to hearing those for the next work plan. Social cohesion being one that has been brought to the table by civil society. And we are going to keep working that through as we get to the third year work plan. I guess in closing, I'd say, if you are interested in the call, go back to the text. Go back to what's been agreed in the voluntary commitments. Work off that, and if there are things in there that are interesting, come back to us. We would be really keen to engage with you on that work. I'll stop right there, but I think looking ahead, there's a really active piece of work over the next couple of months and a work program to deliver in the third year that it will be really important to preserve that multi-stakeholder approach for.
You know, Paul and I were talking, and this has been the common leitmotif of the Christchurch Call in New Zealand, is that so few people know about it in Aotearoa. But of course, it is more widely recognized outside. So there's an interesting, perhaps worth also exploring why that is the case. But I can assure you that the call is very highly regarded, as is the PM's leadership and your work in the Commonwealth and also beyond. Part of this is also to present to you snapshots of the research that NCPACS has done that I've led over the past year as a consequence of my doctoral research into the manner in which Twitter reflected and refracted Christchurch 2 years ago. I'm a very hesitant academic, and I'm not a data scientist either. But what I did was, as I said yesterday, in the immediate aftermath of what happened, I pivoted my doctoral research to look at what was happening in Aotearoa as opposed to what was happening back home in Sri Lanka, which I came here to study. And then one of the op-eds that I published in the local media looked at around 170,000 tweets in the first 48 hours after the massacre. That piqued the interest of Twitter, leading to the Data for Good initiative and partnership, as a consequence of which I looked at about 800,000 tweets and about 14.3 million words in the 6 months after the attack. That has fed into the thesis chapter and that I'm now going to present some interesting perspectives on. And why do I do this? It is not self-promotion. If anything, it is about the work that NCPACS does. But something that I think frustrates many of us is the simplistic narrative around the demonization or the deification of social media platforms. It is one or the other, constantly in the media. Anecdotal, episodic, stochastic, but it's either accompanies all bad or it's all good. And a lot of the nuance, of course, is lost as a consequence of that. Paul, you know this. And one understands why the media does it, because what's very bad or what's very good makes a great story, but it is not a good story for academia. I'm not going to talk about it today, but one of the interesting things that I found out and why this chapter is so interesting for me as a researcher is because it is fundamentally different to the manner in which Twitter reflected and captured the Easter Sunday terrorism in Sri Lanka. And as a consequence of this research here, we find that, unsurprisingly, there is a connection between the political, social, communal culture and the timber and tenor and thrust of political leadership and what is then reflected on Twitter as a platform. That really matters. So I'm going to come back to that a bit later. But to just give you a sense of what I found through the research, it's quite extraordinary, really. The tweets in response to Christchurch were in a couple of languages not even remotely kind of connected to the country. So a lot of, like, I'm talking about tens of thousands of tweets came in Urdu and Hindi and Turkish and Hausa. Hausa is a language spoken in certain parts of Africa, Urdu and Hindi respectively in Pakistan and India, and Turkish obviously in Turkey and other places in the world. Now you would wonder why, and then I go into that data as well, and one of the reasons is that some of the TV anchors who are celebrities in those countries, when they tweeted about the loss of lives of Pakistanis or Indians or about the loss of life in general in Christchurch, gathered a huge amount of interest in their respective countries and languages. That was an outpouring of empathy and pro-social content creation around Christchurch. Really quite extraordinary. Academics call this digital togetherness, and you saw that exclusively almost in terms of the content that came just in the 48 hours after Christchurch. Now, for many of you in the room, this might not be extraordinary, or it might be passé, or you might wonder, of course, it's Christchurch, it's our country, people should be outraged. But that's not the way, actually, generally, the narrative of social media works after terrorism, both leading to terrorism and in response to terrorism. Generally, what social media does, even after Christchurch on some platforms, is that it amplifies the worst amongst us and the worst we can be. Here you found the amplification of our better angels, not just in Aotearoa, but globally. So that's, there's something there that really bears more reflection and study. It happened in lesser degrees, but in similar fashion after 2015's Bataclan attacks in Paris and the 2011 attacks in Norway. And so there is some kind of continuity in the studies that suggest that certain political cultures lead to certain kinds of responses on social media after a cataclysmic event. And I can say that for Sri Lanka, that it led to certain things in the timber that happened, that was present on Twitter after our Easter Sunday, that was very, very different to Aotearoa. What is also really, really interesting for me is that I cannot find statistically important or statistically prevalent measure of hate after Christchurch on Twitter. There was no glorification of the perpetrator. There was no glorification of the manifesto in any language, including in Arabic, for 6 months afterwards. That is not just a consequence of the platform cleaning itself up. You just can't find it. It was almost as if PM Ardern's family, which she also often refers to as New Zealand as being, extended to the rest of the world. And these are just top-line snapshots of data that is quite extraordinary. It's extraordinary for me, and I keep repeating this because it's really fundamentally different to the kind of things that you saw on the same platform after Sri Lanka. So to give you an understanding of why this is interesting is that, and yesterday, some of the panelists spoke of certain platforms as evil, as bad, as wrong, as contributing to toxicity and violence, and yes, all of that is true. But when you look at it, that's the rub, and when you look at it a bit closer, Twitter in particular, but all social media platforms in general, depending on time, depending on the event, depending on the people on it and speaking on it, depending on who they are and what language and what time and what geography, what hashtags, there's a whole range of things that make it such that social media is a complicated beast, and you can't kind of have this black and white approach. And one of the things that I think David Hood from Otago is going to kind of treat us to later on today is how Twitter, in its exchanges within Aotearoa, is fundamentally different to Twitter in Sri Lanka. So why is that? So David has some answers, I have some answers, and I think it's really, it bears reiterating that social media is not one thing or the other thing, and that within a platform and that between platforms there is contestation. I want to end by reading out the last couple of chapters from my chapter, last couple of paragraphs from my chapter that I think will place this all in some context, and also what Paul said as well. So I quote, the Royal Commission of Inquiry's report into the terrorist attack on Christchurch mosques on 15th March 2019 notes how the killers' live stream and violent ideology went viral on social media, including Twitter. However, complicating the report's findings, my research reveals how on Twitter there is scant evidence of content inciting hate that results in sustained or even episodic engagement in violence. On the other hand, the Christchurch massacre brought out, and not for the first time, how social media platforms are ill-equipped to deal with the amplification of gore, violence, and terrorism. However, from media ecologies to political culture, it is clear that many variables determine the use and abuse of social media within and across countries and contexts. So the next chapter, I need to give a bit of context because a staffer of Otago University came up to me on the 15th and said, "Sanjana, you must be used to this." And I didn't quite know how to respond to that person. I think that person meant it in the best of way, thinking that I came from a country that is, of course, no stranger to suicide terrorism and violence in general. And I think the person wanted some sort of an acknowledgement that I don't know, but maybe that I was emotionally more competent and capable of understanding what happened in Christchurch. I don't know, and kind of my entire chapter and thesis is a reflection on, of course, a very personal engagement with violence, and of course, violence in a country that I never expected to study it in. So that's the context to the next paragraph, and I quote, "I started this chapter with how hard it is to answer whether I am, quote unquote, used to dealing with terrorism. Through chance, coincidence, or conscious choice, the circumstances of my life have perversely, perhaps, contributed to mental conditioning that aids the study of the grotesque and gore. And yet, it is not and never easy to study violence and hate." And Kate, you'll agree with this. "New Zealand's tryst with terrorism was tragic. However, the Christchurch massacre's representation on Twitter generates a much stronger case for understanding the context within which social media works. Engrossed in data collection on 15th March 2019, I did not realize the time passed by. By early evening, the university was deserted. The office janitor, Dave, took pains to assure me that he was ashamed of what happened and that it was antithetical to everything that New Zealand stood for." Very sweet, actually, of him. "Go home," he said, saying that he was concerned for my safety given the visible police presence on the streets. His concern pleasantly surprised me. "I am glad my research proves he was not an exception," end quote. I end by recalling, and again, Kate, you'll understand this as perhaps the only two humanities students in this room, the Nigerian author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. And she spoke of the danger of the single narrative. And I think that what Paul and the PM and Christchurch Call as a platform offer within Aotearoa and New Zealand and to the world is a reflection that I see in the data of my research as well, that there is no one story. Adichie warned us against stereotypes because as appealing as they are not the whole story. And very often you find the stereotypical reflection and capture of social media, which of course makes a great headline, but it's not the whole story. It's not the whole story here. It's not the whole story in Sri Lanka. It's never the whole story. And that's kind of what I wanted the second day to reflect on as well, complementing what, Paul, you had to say. So thank you very much for listening to that rant around my research. Listen, to get into the discussion, I know you don't want to take away the thunder from whatever the PM wants to announce in terms of what next. But just for also the Zoom audience who might not have been present yesterday, I think to go back to Richard's point about, you are talking about a fundamental setup, a systemic nature of, say, the violence and its generation and hate and its formation and harm and its amplification, that maybe late stage the call, as you presented it, doesn't quite grapple with. So, I think Richard was trying to suggest that there is an addendum here that's all very well and good, but what about the social cohesion part of the RC report, for example, that is possibly much of it is actually offline, and little of it is online. So, in terms of the future steps moving forward, I think we all understand and appreciate that the call is actually very limited, and you presented it very carefully. But can you tell us, in light of the fact that the RC report is now public and there is this emphasis on social cohesion, what, if anything, is the call going to do around that issue?
It's a really good question, and I guess the first thing I'd say is the scope of the call is to look at the abuse of the internet.
Yep.
And it's from that perspective then we go back to the drivers of the abuse of the internet for terrorist and violent extremist content. So the call actually has commitments on that. It requires governments to look at that work and to do research jointly with companies, to engage civil society in that work. There is work underway through the GNet, which is part of the GIFCT. I mean, one of the big lifts, I think, is in the quality of the research consortia that are working in this area now, and in the diversity of the material that they're starting to produce. And a lot of that goes back to social cohesion and the issues that actually drive offline activity that then is amplified and magnified online. Here in New Zealand, the Royal Commission work, there are the 44 recommendations, and a lot of those go to social cohesion. And we have with us today, I think, my colleague Manisha Bika, who has been working on this with the rest of the Royal Commission team. You've seen, I think, the 33 hui that have been conducted around the country. That is an attempt to try and shift the way we work on this in New Zealand from a government-centric piece. I think we heard from Kate yesterday about the, what's the word? The nature of government being perhaps less diverse than it should be. I was a diplomat once, so I'm framing that differently than Kate.
Kate, what would you say?
I think I probably reflect it, white and middle-aged and middle class. Excellent. Sorry, white and middle class. I think there's work to be done there, and everything I've seen across government is that ministers and the government genuinely committed to that work. To the extent that other countries are looking to do that work as well, I think that's going to be a really important part of the call over time. But in a sense, the call will draw on other work rather than necessarily generate it, if I can put it that way.
So questions, Jeremy?
We have a couple online questions.
We also have one in the room.
And sorry, we have one. Can we take it online and then we'll take someone in the room? So how do the call's signatories and advisory network members reconcile conceptual issues given that many of the stakeholders likely have different definitions of violent extremism and terrorism? So for example, is there concern that some governments may use the call's commitments to crack down on legitimate activism and dissent?
This was one of the issues that we had to grapple with right at the beginning, and it's a fundamental tension in trying to deal with any sort of content online. There are some content issues that are relatively, and I say relatively, straightforward. Sexual exploitation and abuse, reasonably clearly defined, but has some grey areas. Terrorist and violent extremist content, there is a reasonably well-established cohort of material that is defined by the violent nature of it, but then there's quite a large area of material that it's hard to tell. Disinformation, a tiny little area that is well understood, and you're in a tremendously difficult space. And on those last two categories, there is significant overlap between some of the disinformation issues and some of the TVEC issues. I think one of the issues for the call that we put in to try and deal with that question, we did two things. First, we did not specifically try and define terrorism and violent extremism because we would still be drafting at this point. No one has successfully landed on an internationally agreed definition of that to date. We do have work to do on taxonomy because where they have agreed on it, it has been around UN designations, and those are manifestly inadequate for dealing with the problem we have today of diffuse violent extremist groups that often operate in either the nationalist or white supremacist area. There is work to do there. But we did put a flaw in it around international human rights law and fundamental freedoms and a free, open and secure internet. And that is intended to prevent governments doing precisely that. I'm not aware of a government having used the call to do that to date. And I think that the second protection in that is actually a multi-stakeholder community. The nature of bringing those different parties together means that if a government tried to do that, I think the companies would object furiously. Civil society, those in the room who come from the civil society sector will speak better to this than me, but they're there to actually hold us to account. And I think, from our perspective as a New Zealand government, that multi-stakeholder nature is intended to protect against that. Longer term, we'd hope to see the call community mature into a community that's able to have those discussions where governments are doing things that perhaps they might not have intended to do at the time that they supported the call. And I'm thinking about things like internet shutdowns or indiscriminate removal of access to the internet, which are, again, a real problem.
David at the back of the room.
Thank you both for a very interesting and illuminating presentation. Two questions. First, probably directed more to you, Paul. I think there's still a rather large gorilla sitting quietly in the corner of the room of the Christchurch Call, which is the fact that the United States is not a signatory to the Christchurch Call. Given the events of January the 6th, and given the change in direction around international collaboration and engagement currently seen out of the US, what do you think are the chances of the US becoming a signatory? And then could you permit yourself a frolic of the imagination as to what that might potentially mean for the Christchurch Call in that event? And the second question, perhaps that either or both of you could address, is there have been overt calls by other groups, other large platforms, notably TikTok, to say, hey, this is great what's happening in the violent extremist terrorist area, but we're facing acute challenges in other areas, and TikTok in particular was dealing with a particularly horrific viral suicide video, and wrote to other large platforms going, hey, how can we think about teaming up on some of these other critical issues? So the question there is there's no right answer, I don't think, but is the pathway to potentially expand on the base established by the GIFT CT, or is it to establish an equivalent kind of but separate body to look at broader issues?
You go ahead.
Well, we're in big trouble now, because when I'm invited to have a frolic of the imagination, I could go for quite some time. Dealing specifically with the US, the call was designed to be effective and operate in the absence of US support. It has, at the time it was being built, it was hard to know where we would land with the US. The European Union support brings 25% of the world's economies with it. It brings one of the three major regulatory blocks in the world, and it has functioned really well as an organisation and as an entity. And many of those are actually in Asia or in South Asia, and again had strong support there. The second thing I would say is that while it hasn't been formally a supporter, the US has been very supportive of much of what's in the call, and US officials have worked really closely with the call team over the past couple of years and provided really useful input into the work of the call. So they have been very active. The last piece, I wouldn't want to go too deep into where the US is thinking at the moment, because obviously you have a new administration working its way through the details. What I would say is that we and other call supporters would warmly welcome US support for the call. And that's something that we will continue to remain open to and in discussion with the US. In terms of frolicking of the imagination, I think bringing the US on board will bring an enormous amount of capacity and an administration that is having to think very, very hard about some of the issues involved, both in terms of terrorist and violent extremist content, but also the role of tech platforms in society, and in particular some of the issues that are being grappled with all over the world around market dominance and the way we think about that. I think some of the recent appointments to the US administration are very, very significant. The ones announced in the last couple of weeks of people like Tim Wu and Lena Khan, I think speak to a different kind of dialogue in what is a strategically critical sector for the US economy and for all of our economies. So, I think if there, whichever way US decides to go with this, we'll need to work closely with them. They will have a strong interest in these issues, and I think we'll be able to, deliver a really constructive set of outcomes, hopefully with a broader discussion around the role of tech in society that is perhaps a bit more nuanced and less polarised, hopefully.
David, we almost run out of time, but with regards to TikTok, I think one of the other interesting things that's happening currently is the spread of violence in Myanmar over TikTok, which is a polar opposite to what we saw a couple of years ago. It's very, very disturbing, and the platform doesn't seem to be doing anything about it, or doesn't seem to be wanting to do anything about it. I'm not entirely sure what it is. Of course, related to that is the reflection around whatever the oversight board of Facebook will say with regards to the deplatforming of a certain individual earlier this year. And then that then brings out the ripple effects within the industry around what if a certain decision is made around that individual's deplatforming that is counter to the decision taken by the company. What then does how does that then impact on the rest of the companies that the plethora of the rest of the companies that deplatform that individual? So these are, I think, very heavy issues and complicated, complex issues. And in as much as my research can speak to it, there are network effects that kind of riff off each other, and that there are temporal moments within a certain network and within a certain platform that show distinct signatures as well. To make that very simple to the non-technical people in the room, all that means is that you can take down, and Paul can attest to this, you can take down something on one platform, but if it is prevalent on another platform, it invariably morphs and merges and marries itself to platforms that end up in amplifying that content. This is a thorny issue. And Paul, may I just say that, 2 points. When I started with the internet, it was GeoCities and animated GIF cats. It was a nice place. Yep. It was a good place. And of course, now, it's far more complex. And yesterday's discussions around algorithmic transparency seemed to suggest to me that you could just open it up and then examine it like the Coke recipe and everything would be okay. It's not that simple. And it's a matter of fact that I think very few people in these companies even understand the AI that is governing our news feeds. It's that both that fascinating and perhaps also frightening.
Can I just
briefly
to say two things in response to David's question? First, I think we would like to see the GIF-CT stay with and the call stay with a tight focus on TVEC and take that as far as we can, because when we first spun it up, people wanted to deal with digital services taxes, child sexual exploitation, electoral interference, you name it. They wanted to bundle it all in, and that was just going to kill it. If we can take multi-stakeholderism in this area a long way and see that it works, then I think we have a template for looking in other areas. It's a matter of some regret to me, I think, that and I think some concern for all of us that in areas like sexual exploitation and abuse, we've seen in the last few years a polarisation in an area where there previously had been really tight collaboration. And I think a multi-stakeholder approach to that's going to be critical to taking that forward. Finally, I think absolutely agree with you, Sanjana. We can really easily lose sight of all of the amazing things that the internet has brought for us. And the ability to connect, etc. There's a great early line in Singer and Friedman's book on cybersecurity that talks about all the factors you need to think about in considering cybersecurity: regulatory matters, information, the crowd. But the last of them is really important. Of the 6 factors they think you need to take into account, the last is cats. And their advice on that is the internet is and has always been a place of whimsy, that strange and unanticipated things happen. And we need to preserve the fact that both there'll be really great unintended consequences and some really tricky things that we need to deal with. I presented that to Cabinet at times, saying, oh, here are the things we need to focus on. And when I got to cats, I got some strange looks. But actually, when you work your way through it, it's really important to be able to explain. The internet operates in an interesting ecosystem. It's not subject to the control of one or any person. Badass, by using their hashtag against them. Absolutely stunningly good, and that's the whimsy we need to be able to hold on to.
Thank you very much. Extraordinary privilege, Paul, to have you in the room, and thank you for all those questions as well.
Thank you, Sanjana.
Thank you. Do we have the rest, the other 2 speakers, Jeremy? Okay, I'm going to move away from the stage because they are both joining us over Zoom. Elena, Clark, I'm sorry that you had to wait a couple of minutes to join us, but I hope that you were following Paul and I. And I was so excited because a lot of what Paul and I in the first session talked about would be what this session addresses. So it's really cool that there is that segue. If you have been following to any degree yesterday's conversations, I do not introduce the speakers. I leave it to you to introduce yourself. You have 10 minutes to give a lay of the land. I have no particular preference, so if it's all the same with you, Clark, Elena, why don't you take the floor? And Clark, you can follow. And it's so good to see the both of you. Thanks for joining.
It's great to see you too, Sanjana, and thank you for having us here. It's dark here because I'm calling from London. My name is Heleen. I'm the director of Build Up, which is a non-profit that works in peace building in the digital age. And I'm also not going to give myself much of an introduction because, as Sanj said, there's been lots of information shared about us and about our work. You know, when Sanjana invited me to speak at this event, I always like speaking at events that he curates because he always asks the best questions. And he sent me lots of very difficult questions. And I'm only going to answer one. Sorry about that. But I'm going to try and do it well. And then you're going to ask me other questions. One of the questions that Sanj asked is, I'm paraphrasing, if algorithms amplify toxicity, then how do we best combat harm and hate at scale? So it's not a small question, and I know lots of people yesterday and now this morning began to talk about that, but I want to come at this question from maybe just a different perspective that I think can also elucidate a different kind of reflection that builds on what you've been already talking about, which is really the perspective of peace building, which is my professional background, and I think, you know, what I want to do is just talk a little bit about how I would come at this question, and through that bring out a couple of things that we've been doing at Build Up, but really just give a lay of the land. I think because I work in peace building, I understand social media as I would any other context, any other socio-technical context, any other conflict context. And certainly, in particular with social media, a context where conflict is evidently rife. You know, you've talked about, Sanjana, and the previous speakers have talked about hate, incitement. I would also speak about othering and the breaking of social fabric and of social cohesion that goes with othering, and the types of identity formation that go with othering. And the reason I kind of come at social media in this way in particular, and at the online environment in general, as if it were a conflict context, is because when you work in peace building, when you try to work in peace building, one of the first things that you learn is that if you're going to work in peace building, if you're going to try to broker dialogues, to bring people together, to bridge divides, you really need to go into the psychology of conflict. For me, when I was starting in this field, one of the turning points was reading a book that I would really recommend by somebody called James Hillman. He's a psychologist, and he wrote a book called A Terrible Love of War. And in A Terrible Love of War, what James Hillman talks about is that we really need to get into the imagination of war to understand how we might build peace. And for me, it was a huge intellectual turning point because I really took it to heart. I thought, you know, that's how we need to approach any of the work that we do, and when we're trying to bridge divides in society. And that includes the kinds of divides that there are on social media. So what I want to talk about is a little bit how I try to go into the psychology of war, or the psychology of conflict, or the psychology of divide when I look at social media. And I want to come at it in a way through the kinds of activities that peace builders do. So I'm going to try and, it's the first time I do this, Sanjana, so look at what you've done to me. So I'm going to try to go through, you know, the kinds of actions that people working in a conflict context would take, and how they have a parallel on social media that I think is quite illuminating, at least for me. So, you know, one of the first things that happens when anybody working in peace building goes into a conflict environment is that we look to stop what is the most evident violence, right? The most evident physical violence, and this is often through the brokering of ceasefires. And for me, when I look at social media and some of the activities that are happening on social media, it's not unlike trying to broker a ceasefire. So when we look at content moderation or at deplatforming certain people, what we're doing is we're trying to stop the most evident violence that is happening on social media. But one of the challenges with ceasefires in an offline environment is that what you're doing is you're burying the signals of what is a much deeper societal conflict, right? So of course ceasefires are necessary. Of course content moderation and deplatforming people are necessary. But they're also in some ways burying the signals of a conflict that is very evident. So as peace builders, we always move a level down, right? We say, okay, fine, the ceasefire has kind of, you know, stopped things as they are, but we need to go a level deeper. This is not where conflict transformation is going to happen. And so typically in an offline environment, what then happens is you start looking at what are the rules of engagement, right? So you say, okay, Ceasefires are, they will always get broken. So what are the rules of engagement in this conflict environment? And how can we create rules of engagement where violence only happens in certain permitted ways? And I think for me, a lot of the kind of the rules of engagement on platforms are not unlike these rules of engagement in conflict settings as well. But the other thing that happens at this moment in a conflict transformation process is there start to be typically a lot of peace education programs, right? So these are like big messaging programs that sort of say, here's how you should approach the narrative of war. And for me, this is not unlike a lot of the work that I've seen on social media that looks at digital literacy programs. So, hey, listen, we know all of this is happening, all of this incitement is happening on social media, but here is how to approach content that you're seeing. Here's how to understand what is disinformation. Here's how to not fall for fake news or for rumors, right? And this work is very important at this point in a conflict transformation process, right? You have rules of engagement, you have kind of education on how to reinterpret a narrative, and it's very similar on social media. But at some point, even if you are trying to adopt a peace narrative, even if on social media you are trying to behave in ways that you know are responsible, you're still being poisoned by the toxicity around you. This happens in offline environments, and it happens on social media. Even if I want to approach my social media feeds with the eyes of a peace builder, I can still get triggered, because ultimately I'm still being manipulated. And so in traditional peace building, you then go a level deeper, right? You then say, look, this isn't just about rules of engagement and about peace education. It's not just about whether we have ethical rules on a platform and whether we educate people about digital literacy. This is really about the structures that are undergirding this conflict. In an offline conflict, the structures that undergird a conflict are typically economic structures. And I have, over time, begun to understand the structures that undergird the conflicts that we see on social media in a similar way, in the sense that a lot of the social media platforms are operating on a surveillance capitalist model, which needs certain kinds of algorithms and certain kinds of nudges in order to optimize for profit. And those are creating the structures that are increasing polarizing behaviors and that are increasing the kind of manipulation and toxicity that we're seeing on social media. So what do we do as peace builders offline? Offline, what we do is we look at the structures, at the economic structures that are furthering a conflict. We look at the social structures that are furthering a conflict, and we try to create alternative structures. We try to create alternative spaces where behaviors can begin to shift. And the kinds of behaviors that we look at are behaviors like othering, are behaviors like the hegemony of power that is creating narrative. In this work, the question that we have is a question that you and I can ask ourselves, which is, why is this happening to us? It's not why is there conflict out there, is why is this happening to me, right? And this is beginning to go into this idea of the psychology of war. I think one of the things that as a peace builder I see on social media that perhaps is slightly different from other approaches is that I really try to see why is this happening to me and why is this happening to us? So not why is misinformation out there, but why am I attracted to misinformation? Why are we all attracted to misinformation? Why do things in fact go viral? Why do people in fact not leave social media platforms? Why haven't we all left Facebook or Twitter, knowing that it is toxic, right? And this is the kind of the to just speak very briefly about the work that Build Up does. This is a lot of the space in which we operate. So we organize essentially interventions on social media that find conversations through different ways that are showing signs of polarization. So I'm not talking about hate speech, I'm talking about what surrounds hate speech, if you like, and engages the people who are in these polarized conversations in what we hope is a more constructive dialogue, in a dialogue that points out that perhaps there is another hegemony, there is another narrative that there is a way to talk that does not necessarily other, that there is something else that we can build online. Do I have time for something else, Sandra? Would you like me to stop there?
Maybe
'Cause I
we
can stop there.
Yeah, but why don't we pause there, and there's always
Yeah.
space to reflect later on. Clark?
Hi, Sanjana.
Hey.
Hi, everyone else. Thanks so much for having me. I'm going to do a very quick intro to Moonshot, a very quick one. I'll get straight to my kind of opening remarks. So Moonshot, for those who don't know, has the ambitious goal, hence Moonshot, of ending online harms. Everything we do is in service to this goal. And what this really means day to day is that we do social media and platform monitoring to understand how harm proliferates in different online spaces. We run digital campaigns designed to pull people away from harm, offer them alternatives, and we run capacity building both online and when we can on the ground all over the world. As a quick way of bringing some of our work to life, Mr. Ash mentioned earlier the interstitials that appear when you search for keywords related to suicide. He mentioned there are similar initiatives around violent extremism. He's absolutely right. We built that methodology back in 2016 with the support of Jigsaw. It's called the redirect method. And our work has expanded a lot since then, but the same basic premise that you can intervene in an otherwise harmful journey and help that person still powers a lot of what we do. And I'll give some examples of it later on. So the way I've approached this introduction is to give quite a personal and direct answer to the question posed, which, as luck would have it, is exactly the same bit of the question that Helena chose, how best to combat harm and hate at scale, but also by drawing on my work at Moonshot, of course. So as a warning, don't take everything I'm saying as the viewpoint of all my colleagues. We're a beautifully diverse bunch of people, and I wouldn't want you to think I'm talking for all of them. So with that said, over the last 3 years at Moonshot, I've been trying to understand, and in some cases counter, a whole range of different phenomena that fall under the wider umbrella of online harms. And that's things like how gendered jihadist messaging works online, how the violent far right build narratives by curating real news stories in their channels, the way ultranationalism manifests on social media, how the internet is used to both facilitate and offer a way out of violent misogyny, how harmful conspiracy theories cross-pollinate, why media literacy is not a cure for disinformation, as Helena was saying, how comfortable people are sending public death threats to public figures, and the different ways people on different platforms use hate speech. And with all of that stuff behind me, reading the phrase, how best to combat harm and hate at scale, and also because I know Sanjana will want provocative rather than bland statements, I'm going to say the problem is not harm or hate by themselves, the problem is scale. And I'm going to try and argue that point. So there will always be dark corners of the internet, just exactly the same way there are streets that you're always going to avoid. There will always be message boards and platforms and whole sections of the internet that you will always avoid, and that if you visited them would put you at risk of harm. We spend a lot of time in both mainstream and niche online spaces, and if I can give my personal view here, the mainstream frightens me way more than the niche, simply really by virtue of the numbers. The extent to which it's possible to cause harm, whether through widespread manipulation of people's opinions, bullying, harassment, death threats, or organized pile-ons that destroy someone's career and their mental health, the extent to which it's possible to do those things is directly related to the number of users on a platform. And of course, violent right-wing Telegram channels and anarchic image boards and incel forums need to be understood. And in the cases where they're inciting violence or suicidal ideation, they need to be actively monitored and reported. But users on a platform that doesn't contain the mechanics for virality can only do so much harm at scale. So if we want to talk about combating harm and hate at scale, I would start with the biggest mainstream platforms. I'm going to torture a metaphor. I realize people have used it many, many times before, but it doesn't make it any less true that we're living through the Wild West of the internet. In Google, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Amazon, and the rest, we have a new kind of critical infrastructure, not unlike the railroads and the telephone lines of the mid-1800s. Whether we like it or not, people are already dependent on this infrastructure, many of us for work. Businesses live and die by whether they're discoverable on Google, are listed on Amazon, or if they can reach their customers on Twitter. And all of this happened before we figured out how to make them safe. So worn out though it is, I think the analogy of the Wild West still stands, not because the internet is lawless, because reality, as we know, is a lot more complicated than that, but because we've become rapidly dependent on this new critical infrastructure, which has in many ways transformed the world for better, but we've done it before we figured out how to make it safe. Now, whether giant tech companies are precisely analogous to critical infrastructure, or as others have argued, public spaces and public parks, I don't think any of the analogies are perfect, but I think they're useful. It doesn't matter that they're not perfect. They're useful to try and emphasize because they can make what feels like an intangible, intractable problem feel a little bit more tangible and solvable. And to see what I mean, if we look at some actual critical infrastructure in public spaces and some assumptions that we make about them, or that we take for granted, nobody complains that the kids' play area in your park has a spongy floor, or that there's no broken glass, or that motorways have crash barriers, or that 87% of countries worldwide mandate that we use seatbelts in cars. The Postal Service is not allowed to open our mail, read our letters, and then send us adverts based on what we wrote in our letters. In my hometown of Manchester, the gap between the fixed public benches is just slightly narrower than a transit van, so that no one can drive into the space and run people over. No one complains about these things. Public spaces and critical infrastructure contain design choices put there, often by regulation, to protect us. And it's a process, it's a journey. Car manufacturers were furious about seatbelts, but now we won't set off without them, not because it's not legal, but because it's safer to use them. We're beginning to see huge tech companies try similar ideas. Twitter, as you may have noticed, now suggests that you read an article before retweeting it, although it doesn't, it still lets you retweet it, but it gets in the way. Facebook have tried a variety of things. They're not very public about what worked and what didn't, but for example, they tried sending you a private notification if you posted a known piece of misinformation about COVID. And we take it completely for granted, but all mainstream platforms regularly remove huge amounts of harmful content. Now, we all know it's not enough. It's not happening quickly enough. We see this every single day. And of course, by building and profiting from unregulated critical infrastructure, they have facilitated widespread harm. But nonetheless, I feel like, and Sanjana touched on this earlier, the sort of the paucity of debate around this, it's inexorable that our big digital public spaces will, eventually be similar in their protections to our physical public spaces. And that brings us, I think, to two big questions that I want to highlight. The first one is about who drives that change. Either the platforms get ahead of it and they fix it themselves, or they will be regulated into shape. I think it is as simple as that. And on that debate, essential though it is, I'm a spectator. The other question is the one I'm professionally interested and involved in, which is what do we do in the meantime? While those debates rage on, what are we doing about the people using these platforms, both to move towards harm and express their desire to escape it? One upside of it being the Wild West is that the same techniques available to those who would do harm online are available to those of us who are trying to reduce it. And in this sense, organizations like Build Up and Moonshot are in some ways playing in a space that shouldn't really exist. At Moonshot, a lot of what we do comes down to reaching people at risk of harm and offering them an alternative path, some sort of way out. And in doing so, we're effectively supplying the guardrails that should be, and in my opinion, hopefully one day will be, an inherent part of these platforms' infrastructure. I said I'd give some examples of the things we kind of find out, just for our ability to combat harm and hate at scale, but for how those platforms should also be doing it. So to bring that to life, I'll just give a couple of examples and then I'll hand back. For example, you can use commercially available tools to reach an audience of people defined not by their age, their ethnic background, or their religious beliefs or anything else, but purely by what they're looking for online. You can reach them with narratives that deliberately seek to undermine the harmful narrative they were searching for. Or if they're searching for known pieces of disinformation, you can reach them with evidence to the contrary or tools to teach them critical thinking. Or maybe they're searching for neo-Nazi death metal. Well, then you can send them to death metal that has nothing to do with Nazism. You can test the effectiveness of different types of content too. You can test whether a comedy sketch about joining ISIS is watched more by people who were actually trying to join ISIS than something else. You can see if people are trying to join other violent extremist groups. So they're typing in how to join the 3%ers around January 6th. You can see if they'll engage with mindfulness and well-being content, or maybe just a bubble that says breathe in, breathe out. And we found that they would, significantly more so than other much more narrative-based content. You can even do something like running a hyper-locally tailored campaign that shows people searching for really high-risk terms where their local park is and tells them to just go for a walk. And you can also connect them to offline support services, to real-world counseling and intervention providers. And in many cases, they will take the chance and they will use them. We've done all of these things and more, and we will keep doing it, because until our digital public spaces undergo major reform, combating hate and harm at scale surely requires us to experiment and to innovate and to connect people with information and services that can support instead of harm them. And we need to do this at pace and at the same massive scale.
Thank you.
So thanks. I'll leave it there for now
Yep.
and hand it back.
Yeah, thanks, Clark. I'm just going to immediately open it up for questions, and I just wonder, I mean, I don't want to ask the two of you to reflect on this, but it is something that I've been talking about with some of the people in the room. Does all of this work over instant messaging? It assumes that what is observable and what is possible to respond to is also possible to harvest for research purposes or for regulatory purposes as well. What happens with encrypted messaging? Which is absolutely critical to activism and advocacy, but of course a point of contention for regulatory oversight and legal frameworks around the world which seek to quote-unquote backdoors into it, sometimes for the best of intent, but of course it provides a template for authoritarianism and autocracy to adapt and adopt for their purposes as well. So that's, I'm sure, something that Elena and Clark are also thinking about as we move forward, but I'm going to immediately open it up to the floor. I know there are people who are very interested in this issue. And Jeremy, if you could just monitor Zoom as well. I'm going to take two questions, one after the other. Kate and David, if you could just pass the mic. Oh, yeah? Oh, okay, all right, so just Kate.
Thank you. That was super, super interesting. I just really kind of wanted to ask both of you what you think about this, the idea of the public space. This is something I've been thinking about and talked about yesterday. Given that we know that women and gender minorities are not safe in our real public spaces, thinking through how we can then create these online public spaces with these kind of town planning and human geography and ways of structuring that you've just mentioned, Clark, which are really helpful, that will actually stop women having to carry their keys in their fists, both literally and figuratively, everywhere they are. That's kind of my provocation.
Clark, you want to take a crack at that?
Sure. That's an excellent and very timely question. My immediate reaction is that we first of all should obviously be learning from the faults of our offline public spaces before we start mapping one onto the other. It also strikes me that, and I said the analogies aren't perfect, and they're not, because there are obvious structural differences, but there are structural advantages to digital public spaces. They are regulatable in a way that offline spaces are not. It is actually possible, despite the fact that they haven't done it, to create an algorithm that can flag hate speech and do something about it, and that can specifically protect protected characteristics on digital platforms in a way that you can't do similarly offline. It's a source of frustration to me that isn't already a functioning sort of advantage of places like Twitter. I hope one day that it will be, but I think it's an incredibly important point that you sort of allude to, that we shouldn't assume offline public spaces are perfect and therefore a blueprint, because they're not.
Elena, do you want to chip in briefly around that question? I'm sure you have some thoughts.
Yeah, so Clark and I are both sitting in London, which I think is why this comment feels particularly timely. And one of the responses to the kidnapping and murder of Sarah Everard in London recently has been a movement of women taking to the streets, again, around the slogan, "Reclaim the Streets," which of course is one that has been used very often before. And I think, a bit like Clark was saying, that while the infrastructure is sorted out, there is some space for important space that needs to be taken up by activism and the kind of work that Moonshot and Build Up do. I think it's similar when it comes to the safety of women online. I think there's something around reclaiming social media space, and that's certainly what the Commons, which is the main intervention that we have on social media, tries to do, reclaiming narratives on social media, and through that, trying to create some safe space before the infrastructure is there, so that we don't have to hold our keys in public spaces or online, figuratively.
Jeremy, you have a question
So
from
we
Zoom.
have an online question. In terms of preventing violent extremism, especially in youth, what changes would you make for digital platforms in general to make your job easier? So perhaps this is the intermediary question. We have the ideas of what we'd like to look like in the future, the Paul's frolic of imagination, but how do we get there? What are some things that we can do in the here and now to help get there?
Elena, you're on screen. You can take a crack at that and followed up by Clark.
I mean, I think this one is actually very clearly directed at Clark, because we don't work so much on extremism. But I think what I would say is that having this is probably music to the ears of the researchers in the room, but having access to data that allows us to really analyze and understand behaviors is incredibly helpful to the kind of work that we're doing. Now, of course, that kind of transparency can be used by the same people who are trying to promote extremist narratives. But I think, sort of having a level playing field and being able to have the kind of data that we need to understand where polarizing behaviors are taking place and how they're working is incredibly important. And that's been, it is something which the major platforms have been increasingly making possible. So certainly more in that direction is what I would say.
Clark, brief take on that?
Sure. I really wish that they would admit what they can't do and what they don't know.
Yep.
I would wish they would admit the scale of the problem and ask for help when they need it and have the confidence to do that without thinking that we'll all abandon their platform tomorrow. To pick a very quick example, it's extremely difficult to detect anti-Semitism online because it uses so many tropes and allusions and references that if you don't know it's anti-Semitic, you may miss it. It's extremely difficult to detect that in a way that it's much easier to detect racism. They're going to need help with that, right? If you're building a social media platform, why would there be an expert on anti-Semitism? You need help. Come out and say you need help. The world is full of experts, and we are really up for helping you where you need subject matter expertise. Is one wish that I have.
I hope that, though, Clark, doesn't mean that it's a parasitical relationship. That's a whole parenthetical issue, but what some of us from the Global South have been experiencing over the past couple of years is that promises to Congress around AI and ML, literally translate into us helping pro bono some of these platforms fight their fires on their behalf. So I take your point, but it shouldn't be parasitical, and that's a broader question, I think.
It definitely shouldn't. It definitely has been, and it needs to stop.
Yeah. We have a question from the room.
Hi, I was really interested in the idea that you address a conflict with this kind of social identity tactic of trying to counter othering, and I'm really curious to know what that would look people's identities, or to stop them seeing other people as others.
Should I have a go at that one?
Yeah, go ahead.
First, yeah. So the techniques that we use in our online interventions are rooted in nonviolent communications, which are essentially the same set of techniques that we would use offline, but we adapt them to online. And so a lot of this has to do with first identifying a post where othering is taking place. And often, I just want to point out that a lot of othering is, not all, but the kind of othering that we are most focused on is not necessarily intentional. So it's the use of othering terms, even when people don't realize that's what they're doing, because that's where identity construction starts, and it's where conflict identities begin. And then the techniques of nonviolence basically begin with active listening and an acknowledgement of what is being said, even where that's hurtful. And that doesn't require us to agree with what is being said, but simply to ask an open question about why are you saying this? Where is this coming from? I hear this is what you're saying. This is my position. Where are you going with this? And interestingly, even just that very starting act of listening, we get a lot of feedback saying it's the first time this happens to me on social media. In a lot of dialogues, that's often the case. People who are expressing othering also have a grievance underneath it. And then nonviolence, it's a whole, I can't give a whole thing on nonviolence, but just to say one other thing, The whole point is to kind of use active listening as a technique to rehumanize a relationship. And through that, to try and open up the possibility for a very human connection. So it's really, I'm happy to point to some resources. We produced a guide on how to use these kind of techniques during the inauguration in the US, for example, which could provide some examples.
Any other questions in the room? Any other questions online? David? No? So, I mean, we have a bit of time. Can I get the both of you to address what I kind of hinted at, which is that, particularly in the global south, but globally, you're seeing either demographically or the larger user base move into what is relatively open to what is definitely closed. It is a big challenge for researchers like myself. In fact, my PhD wouldn't be possible a couple of years down the line if the current trends persist and grow at pace, where a lot of the discussion is actually around instant messaging platforms where the data is basically impossible to kind of harvest for research purposes. So how then do we apply all of what you said today in 2021 to what is a frontier issue in March of this year, but is going to be a front door issue sooner than we think?
Clark, if you want, I have a very direct answer to this because I was thinking about it when Sanj first raised it. Sanjana, you may recall that when we started doing interventions on social media, we were very much going the route similar to some of the techniques that you use for your research of kind of looking at very large public data sets and then identifying public profiles and intervening in a very public way. And we actually started in our latest iteration of work in the US, we shifted to very much cultivating private practices in private networks. So even just sticking to Facebook, we realized a lot of the conversations that we needed to be activating on where othering is happening were happening in behind closed doors, right? So not accessible for the kind of public research that you're talking about. So our approach now is actually to build a movement of people who are active within their networks. A lot of the polarization that happens that then leads to the kind of incitement and extremism that Moonshot and Clark are dealing with is happening in private networks and very close to us. So 1 or 2 degrees of separation. So our tactic as an intervention, this doesn't answer your research question, but as an intervention is to cultivate a network of people and a movement of people who is practicing behavior change in their own private social networks. So we've shifted from trying to attain scale through automation to trying to attain scale through movement building. And that's been in response very much to the kind of trends that you're seeing of private messaging.
Yeah, it was also a kind of a trick question to get you to reflect on perhaps issues that the Christchurch Call may want to look at post the Royal Commission report around social cohesion. If they are, I think, if I'm bold enough to suggest only looking at the kinds of pathways of radicalization today, you're not going to kind of embrace what the future holds. Clark, anything that you're seeing from your end?
Yeah, I think a few thoughts on that, and I overall I completely agree. Like we have to move. If that's the trend, we have to move with it. There's no good sticking our heads in the sand, even though it might be difficult. But my immediate thoughts are the thing about working on violent extremism in particular is they will always need to recruit. So they may flock to more secure private spaces for some conversations. That certainly makes our life harder, but they will always need to recruit. And you see this with armed groups in the US. Of course, they have closed Telegram channels we're not in, but they also have their recruitment channels. Proud Boys Uncensored is deliberately, they know that there are journalists in there and they pander to it, but they still give off incredibly interesting signals about the way that they are running that operation. Also, people trying to join these groups will usually still start with search. They may end up in a very closed, difficult to access public space, but they will start with search, and we also want to reach them at that point. At the other end of that journey, where people are organizing to violence, we can be in those spaces. If that's what's happening in them, and for that matter, law enforcement can also be in those spaces. Probably more importantly for our work, we can also be in those spaces to offer help, and we have done this. We have used closed WhatsApp chats with a counselor in there and redirected people into those very same spaces that they're comfortable being in for other purposes in order to get help. So the fundamental answer is adapt and find a way to still use those spaces to our advantage, but don't forget that it will never only be about them. There will always be activity upstream of that where we can also intervene and help.
Final question, if nobody else in the room, Jeremy, just to check whether we have a question online. Clark. Oh, okay, go ahead.
In terms of digital literacy in the education system, do you think there's an example of this operating well? And if so, where? If not, how can this be initiated effectively?
We kind of talked about this yesterday, but you guys can give your thoughts today as well. Clark, you're on screen, so you can take a crack. Oh, sorry, now you're on Helena.
I'm actually, it's a constant source of irritation to me that nobody at school told me that coding would have been a much more sensible thing to be studying than everything else I was doing. I'm now too old to know what kids are taught in schools, so I don't have an immediate example to hand. I think there is no question that it's not good enough, but I also actually think that perhaps more importantly than railing against the curriculum as it currently is, first of all, kids, as we all were when we were kids, were very good at teaching ourselves new technology. I would actually say lifelong learning on this subject is probably more important, because Snapchat makes me feel old. There needs to be, and I'm only 35, there needs to be something there for the new digital arrivals at whatever age you're at. So we definitely need to look at the education system, but I would say digital awareness and media literacy needs to be being taught to us throughout our lives, because that ground will shift as we otherwise stop traditionally learning, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Elena?
So I have a 4-year-old, and I think about this quite a lot. I haven't seen it done well anywhere, but I do have some thoughts. You know how sex education in schools was generally terrible because they tried to teach things theoretically and nobody really then applied it, at least in my experience. Maybe it was a very European experience. And I feel a little bit the same about digital literacy. I think that when digital literacy it's taught as a set of precepts or a set of values that we're supposed to follow. And I wish it were taught more as a set of practices, or something where if you do this, here's where you can come for help. I think that would be much more effective. And in the courses that we run, which are not for young people, they're for adults. They're practicums. So they're not like, here's how you should be doing things, or here's what should be happening. But it's rather go out and try this on your newsfeed, and if it doesn't work, come back and tell us, and we'll problem solve.
Yeah.
And I think something like that might be much more effective.
Fantastic. I think we'll wrap up there. Also cognizant of the fact that a lot of the issues that that question raised will be covered in what Jeremy is going to curate with youth, by youth, for youth, and the rest of us in the room who are not youth. Later on today in the afternoon, and hope you can stick around. Elena, please give a big hug and a kiss to Gael. And Clark, thanks very much for joining us. Gael is Elena's small fellow who's growing up too fast, who I love quite a bit. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Sandana.
Yeah, and it's
Thanks so much.
lovely to have you. Thank you. For those of you, thank you. For those of you on Zoom, we are going to break for 15 minutes for tea, coffee here. And for those of you in the room, we are going to break for 15 minutes for tea and coffee. Ladies and gentlemen, if we can bring our tea and coffee back to our tables, we can start the next session about a minute late. Shocking stuff. Shocking stuff. If there are any Swiss on the call, I apologize. Or Germans. If there are any Sri Lankans on the call, I also apologize for starting on time. Thanks very much. At least for me, I have all these neurons firing when I hear certain leitmotifs of the conversations because I know what the day holds and what the day was designed to hold. So from the first interaction with Paul to the second session with Elena and Clark to this session with Thomas and David, I think that you'll see also as participants and also people joining us on Zoom that there are leitmotifs, commonalities, key ideas, key issues that bind the conversation today and all the sessions together. So it is my great pleasure to have on stage here in Dunedin David Hood from Otago and Thomas Beagle, not from Otago, but in Otago. So as has always been the case, I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves. May I say that, David, I've been following your Twitter and your work for a very long time, secretly from the shadows on Twitter, and I find it absolutely fascinating. And I think that the audience will as well in Aotearoa, New Zealand, because you'll understand, it riffs off the work that NCPAX has been doing, but also gives a real perspective into the country through this one platform. So a huge fan of your work.